The blizzard raged like a living thing, its icy tendrils clawing through the dense pines that surrounded Dr. Ethan Hale's cabin. Snow whipped violently against the wooden walls, muffling the world outside in a frosty shroud. Ethan leaned against the edge of his small wooden worktable, sipping his coffee, the rich, bitter warmth spreading through him. The fire crackling in the stone hearth cast flickering shadows across the room, the only sound in the otherwise silent solitude of his mountain retreat. It was the life he'd chosen, remote, quiet, untouched by the complications of the world he had left behind. A sudden, thunderous roar shattered the stillness. The sound was alien, deep, guttural, and loud enough to rattle the windows in their frames. Ethan stood rigid, his heart pounding as another noise followed, this one sharper, like metal being torn apart. A vibration rippled beneath his feet, faint but undeniable. Then, silence returned, as suffocating as the snowstorm itself. Ethan grabbed his coat and boots, adrenaline driving him outside. The biting wind cut through his wool scarf, and snowflakes pelted his face, but he pressed forward, drawn toward the source of the disturbance. He trudged through the deep snow, his boots crunching in rhythmic defiance of the storm. Then, over the ridge, he saw it. An enormous blackened vessel lay half buried in the snow. The craft was sleek and angular, its surface covered in jagged red scorch marks. Its design was unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. The hull shimmered faintly, not metallic but some hybrid of material he couldn't place. Energy pulsated along faint crimson lines that webbed the ship's surface, flickering erratically. Smoke and steam rose into the frigid air, mixing with the storm's fury. Ethan's breath caught as he climbed down the ridge, moving closer to the wreckage. Scattered debris littered the snow, some pieces glowing faintly as if retaining residual heat. The acrid scent of burning metal mixed with something sharper, more chemical. Every instinct told him to turn back, but he couldn't. Something or someone might need help. As he approached the ship, a faint sound reached him through the storm, a soft, pained groan. His pulse quickened. He clutched the strap of his medical bag tighter and moved toward the sound, weaving through the twisted remains of the vessel. The groan grew louder, punctuated by shallow, labored breathing. Then he saw her. She lay crumpled near a broken console inside the gaping hull, framed by tangled wires and broken glass like shards. Her skin was deep violet, luminous in the pale light of the storm. Long crimson hair, streaked with soot, spilled across her shoulders, clinging to her skin where patches of frost had formed. Her attire, torn and stained, was a strange mix of flowing fabric and metallic components, clearly designed for both beauty and function. A jagged piece of debris had pierced her side, and a thick, glowing liquid seeped from the wound, staining the snow beneath her. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of fiery gold. She fixed him with a gaze that held both pain and strength, as though she refused to succumb to her injuries despite their severity. When she spoke, her voice was low and melodic, carrying a lilt that felt both alien and oddly familiar. "Help," Mishi whispered, her words trembling in the frigid air. Ethan's breath hitched. She spoke his language, though her tone carried an accent unlike any he'd heard. Questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? What was she? How could she know his tongue? But her pained expression silenced them. There was no time for hesitation. "I'll get you out of here," he said, his voice firm despite his racing thoughts. Ethan knelt beside her, assessing the wound. The glowing substance that seeped from her side pulsed faintly, as though alive. He pressed a hand to the wound, noting the strange elasticity of her skin, softer and warmer than he expected. She winced, and her hand, a slender, five-fingered appendage not unlike his own, gripped his wrist. "Careful," she murmured. Her words were strained but carried an air of authority, a regal weight that suggested she was more than a mere survivor. "Just hold still," Ethan said, his tone softening. "This might hurt." He removed the jagged piece of metal embedded in her side, his hand steadied despite the strange heat emanating from the wound. She gasped, her fingers tightening on his wrist, but she didn't cry out. He tore strips from his scarf to fashion a temporary bandage, wrapping it tightly around her midsection. Her blood, if it could be called that, coagulated quickly, forming a shimmering crust over the injury. "We need to move," he said. This storm will kill us both if we stay out here." She nodded weakly. Ethan slipped an arm under her shoulders and lifted her. Despite her slender frame, she was surprisingly heavy, as though her body held more density than a human's. She leaned against him, her breathing shallow, her golden eyes flickering shut. The journey back to the cabin was grueling. The storm howled around them, and Ethan's legs burned as he fought to keep them both upright. By the time they reached the cabin, his fingers were numb, and his breaths came in ragged gasps. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, lowering her onto the couch near the fire. Ethan worked quickly, cleaning the wound with antiseptic and securing it with more sturdy bandages. He hesitated only once when he noticed how her skin seemed to absorb the heat from his hands, growing faintly warmer beneath his touch. Her breathing steadied, though her features remained tight with pain. As he worked, fragments of her story emerged in disjointed murmurs. She spoke of betrayal, of enemies hunting her, of a ship that had been sabotaged. She mentioned a father, a king, and a throne she'd fled to protect. Her voice carried a desperation that Ethan couldn't ignore. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Ethan sat beside her, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Her presence filled the small cabin with questions, each more impossible than the last. Who was this violet-skinned, golden-eyed woman? What kind of life had she left behind? And what kind of danger had followed her here? Ethan didn't sleep that night. Instead, he stoked the fire and prepared for the unknown, knowing this encounter was only the beginning of something far larger than himself. Ethan Hale crouched near the fire, feeding it another log as warmth gradually filled the cabin. The violet-skinned woman, Nicera, stirred on the couch, her breath slow but steady. Her glowing blood had dried, forming a crystalline crust over the wound he'd bandaged. The sight still baffled him. Her biology was so alien, yet strangely efficient. Her skin shimmered faintly in the firelight, and her crimson hair spread like a halo against the cushions. Despite her injury, she exuded a quiet strength, an unspoken command over her surroundings. Ethan found himself both drawn to her presence and wary of what it might mean. She woke abruptly, her golden eyes snapping open. The pupils, slit like a predator's, dilated as she scanned the room. When her gaze landed on him, her body tensed, instinctively defensive. Ethan raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "You're safe," he said softly, careful to keep his tone steady. "This is my cabin. No one's coming for you here." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though her expression remained guarded. She pushed herself upright, wincing as her hand brushed her injured side. Ethan moved closer, kneeling beside her. "Careful," he said. "You're still healing." She studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes piercing, as though she were weighing his words. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying an accent that made her speech melodic, each word deliberate. "You saved me," she said, her tone matter-of-fact but laced with curiosity. "Why?" Ethan shrugged, trying to sound casual. "You needed help. That's what I do." Even for someone like me, her gaze didn't waver, and her question hung in the air, heavier than he expected. Ethan met her eyes, unwilling to look away. "You're alive. That's all that matters to me." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling fire. Then she nodded, the faintest flicker of approval in her expression. She shifted, leaning back against the cushions, though her posture remained regal despite her obvious pain. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ethan," he replied. "Ethan Hale." "I am Nicera," she said, her voice softening. "Daughter of King Livarus of the Alithian Dominion." Ethan blinked, unsure how to respond. Her words carried the weight of authority, but they sounded impossibly foreign, like something from a distant dream. He leaned back, processing what she'd said. "Your royalty," he said finally, though it sounded more like a question. Was she corrected, her tone sharper now? "The moment I fled, I forfeited my claim to the throne." "Why did you flee?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle but probing. He sensed the answer was not one she gave easily. Nicera's golden eyes darkened, her gaze drifting toward the fire. "There are those in my father's court who believe him unfit to rule. They see his compassion as weakness. A faction conspired to seize power, and I discovered their plans. When I attempted to warn him, they moved to silence me. Her hand brushed her side where the glowing blood had stained his makeshift bandages. My ship was sabotaged. They knew I would run. They hunted me across the stars, determined to extinguish the last voice that could expose them. Ethan absorbed her words, his mind spinning. The implications were staggering: a coup, a royal fugitive, a galactic power struggle. Yet Nicera spoke with such calm certainty, as if these events were as natural as the rising sun. "And now they're here," he said, "on Earth." She nodded. "If they find me, they will kill me. Then they will kill anyone who has aided me." Ethan's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He had faced danger before: wars, disasters, the worst humanity could throw at itself, but this was different. This was bigger, stranger, and far more personal than anything he'd encountered. "We'll deal with that if it happens," he said firmly. "Right now, you need to focus on recovering." Nicera tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You speak as though you have a plan." Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "Not yet, but I'm good at thinking on my feet." She regarded him with something approaching amusement, though it faded quickly. "Your courage is commendable, Ethan Hale, but you underestimate the threat. These are not simple soldiers. They are assassins, bred and trained to eliminate obstacles without hesitation." "Then it's a good thing I've got you to teach me what I'm up against," Ethan said, standing to stoke the fire. He turned back to her, his tone softening. "You said your people speak another language. How are we able to understand each other?" Nicera's hand touched her neck, just below her ear. "I carry a translator embedded in my body. It interprets thoughts and transmits them in the language of the listener." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "That's incredible." "Primitive by our standards," she said, though her tone wasn't unkind. "Your species has much to learn." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, well, we're doing our best." Nicera's lips quirked in a faint smile, but it vanished as quickly as it came. "You are unlike the others of your kind." He frowned. "You've met humans before." "No," she admitted, "but I have studied your species. Many are driven by fear or greed. You seem different." Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, peering out at the snow-covered forest. "I've seen enough of what fear and greed can do. I guess I'm just trying to be better than that." Nicera watched him in silence, her golden eyes thoughtful. For a moment, neither spoke, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then a high-pitched whine shattered the quiet. Ethan turned sharply, his hand already reaching for the rifle he kept near the door. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint vibration that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. Nicera stood, wincing as she clutched her side. "A scout drone," she said, her voice low. "They've found me." Ethan grabbed the rifle, checking its chamber. "How many?" "Just one," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But if it signals them, more will come." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He opened the door a crack, the cold air biting at his skin. In the distance, a sleek black drone zipped through the trees, its red sensor beam scanning methodically. "Stay inside," he told Nicera. "I'll handle this." Before she could protest, he slipped out into the snow, moving quickly but carefully. The drone hovered 20 yards away, its sensor light sweeping the area. Ethan crouched behind a tree, raising the rifle. His breath misted in the frigid air as he steadied his aim. The beam swept closer, illuminating the ground near his feet. He fired. The shot rang out, sharp and decisive, and the drone jerked violently before spiraling to the ground. Sparks flew as it crashed, its red light fading to black. Ethan approached the wreckage cautiously, kicking the remains to ensure it was fully disabled. Satisfied, he turned back toward the cabin. Nicera stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Impressive," she said as he stepped inside. "For a human." Ethan grinned, leaning the rifle against the wall. "I'll take that as a compliment." For the first time, Nicera's guarded demeanor softened. "Perhaps you are more capable than I thought." Ethan shrugged, his smile fading. Let's hope it's enough. As the fire crackled in the hearth, the weight of their predicament settled over them. Outside, the snow fell in silence, but Ethan knew that quiet wouldn't last. Whatever Nicera had brought to his doorstep was far from over. The cold morning sunlight streamed weakly through the cracks in the hydroelectric station's walls, illuminating the frost-coated machinery and peeling concrete. It had been years since this place had thrummed with life, but now its silence felt almost oppressive. Ethan knelt by the control panel, tracing a series of rusted wires with his gloved hand, while Nicera stood guard near the entrance. Her golden eyes scanned the tree line beyond the shattered windows, her posture tense and alert. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice low and steady. Despite her injuries, she stood tall, her regal bearing unshaken by the hostile wilderness or the dire circumstances. The pale light highlighted the faint shimmer of her violet skin and the metallic crimson of her hair, which spilled over her shoulders like molten copper. Ethan didn't look up from his work. "If these turbines are going to work, I'll need to reroute the power. This station's older than dirt, and I'm pretty sure half of it's rusted shut." Nicera stepped closer, her boots crunching on the icy floor. "You're certain this place can generate enough energy to activate the transponder?" "It's our best shot," Ethan replied, shrugging. "Unless you've got a pocket generator hidden somewhere in that fancy armor of yours." Nicera's lips twitched into the faintest smirk, but the moment passed quickly. She turned her gaze back to the forest, her sharp features hardening. "They'll come as soon as we activate it. We must be prepared." Ethan set his tools down and glanced up at her. "You keep saying that like I'm not already halfway through planning my funeral. What exactly are we up against?" Nicera hesitated, her fingers tightening around the hilt of the blade she had salvaged from her ship. It wasn't much a small, elegantly curved dagger with faintly glowing etchings, but it gave her some sense of control. "Their technology far surpasses anything your world has conceived. They use drones, like the one you destroyed, to scout and gather data. But the real threat lies in their Sentinels, elite soldiers engineered for precision and brutality." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Engineered?" "They are enhanced, both biologically and mechanically," Nicera explained. Her voice was calm, but a shadow of something darker flickered in her golden eyes. "Stronger, faster, devoid of hesitation. They will not falter, and they will not show mercy." Ethan let out a low whistle. "Great. And here I was thinking the drone was a pain." Nicera stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "You joke, but this is no trivial matter. When they come, it will not be a fight. It will be a massacre." Ethan straightened, his expression serious now. "Then we make sure they don't win. If they're as efficient as you say, we'll have to outthink them." Nicera tilted her head, studying him. "And how do you propose we do that?" "I'll figure something out," Ethan said, a hint of determination creeping into his voice. "I always do." The hours passed in tense silence, punctuated only by the groaning protests of ancient machinery as Ethan worked to restore power to the station. Nicera helped where she could, her movements measured but deliberate. Despite the lingering effects of her injuries, she refused to sit idle. "Why do you do this?" she asked at one point, her voice soft but inquisitive. "You could have left me in the snow, pretended you never found me. Why risk your life for someone you don't even know?" Ethan paused, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze distant. "Let's just say I've spent too much time running from things. People, responsibilities. When you showed up, I figured, maybe it's time to stop." Nicera's golden eyes softened, but her tone remained measured. "And yet you have no reason to trust me." "Call it a gut feeling," Ethan said, offering a wry smile. "You don't seem like the type to blow up half a planet just because someone looked at you wrong." Her lips quirked into the faintest smile. "You would be surprised." The moment of levity was short-lived. A faint hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Nicera's head snapped toward the window, her hand flying to the dagger at her side. Ethan grabbed his rifle and moved to her side, peering out into the snow-covered forest. "They're here," Nicera said, her voice low. "I can feel them." Ethan squinted, scanning the tree line. At first he saw nothing, just the shifting shadows of wind-blown branches. Then, a flicker of movement, a flash of black against the white. His heart sank as the figures emerged from the forest. They were humanoid, but their movements were unnervingly precise, their sleek, armored forms blending seamlessly with the environment. Their helmets glinted faintly in the light, and their weapons sleek, compact devices that looked far deadlier than his rifle were raised and ready. "Sentinels," Nicera said, gripping her dagger tightly. "2 of them." Ethan swallowed hard. "That's too many." "They're assessing the situation," Nicera said, her eyes narrowing. "They won't strike until they're certain of our location." "Well, let's not give them the satisfaction," Ethan muttered, checking his rifle. "How do we deal with these things?" Nicera hesitated. "Separately, if possible. Together they'll be coordinated. Flank them, divide their attention." Ethan nodded, his mind racing. He gestured toward the far side of the station. "There's a maintenance corridor over there. Might be able to loop around and catch one from behind." Nicera inclined her head. "I'll draw their focus. Stay hidden until you have a clear shot." "Wait," Ethan said, his hand brushing her arm. "You're still hurt." Nicera's gaze hardened. "I am still capable." Before Ethan could argue, she slipped out the door, her movements swift and silent. He swore under his breath, gripping his rifle tightly as he followed her lead, keeping to the shadows. The sentinels moved with eerie precision, their steps barely making a sound as they advanced toward the station. Nicera emerged from cover, her blade catching the light as she charged. The sentinels reacted instantly, their weapons firing bursts of searing blue energy. Nicera darted to the side, her movements fluid despite her injury. She closed the distance with startling speed, her blade slicing through the air. Ethan circled around, using the chaos to his advantage. He raised his rifle, aiming for the sentinel furthest from Nicera. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled. He squeezed the trigger, and the shot rang out, striking the sentinel in the back of its helmet. The figure staggered, its movements faltering just long enough for Nicera to close in and drive her blade into its chest. The second sentinel turned, its weapon trained on Nicera. Ethan fired again, the bullet grazing its shoulder. It spun toward him, and he ducked behind a rusted generator as blue energy seared the air above his head. "Now," Ethan, Nicera shouted, her voice sharp. He darted from cover, raising his rifle once more. The sentinel's movements were swift, but Nicera was faster. She leaped onto its back, her blade slashing through the exposed joints of its armor. The sentinel fell to the ground with a metallic crash, its weapon clattering beside it. The forest fell silent once more. Ethan lowered his rifle, his chest heaving as adrenaline coursed through him. Nicera stood over the fallen sentinels, her blade dripping with dark, viscous fluid that glowed faintly. She turned to him, her golden eyes steady but unreadable. "You fought well," she said simply. Ethan let out a shaky laugh. "I think I'm going to need a stronger word than well." Nicera allowed herself a small smile before sheathing her dagger. They were only the beginning. More will come. Ethan nodded, his expression hardening. "Then we'd better finish what we came here to do." Together they turned back toward the station, the hum of the transponder core growing louder with every step. The battle had only just begun. The hum of the transponder core echoed through the abandoned hydroelectric station, its golden light pulsating faintly against the cracked concrete walls. Ethan leaned against a rusted control panel, his breathing steady, but his body heavy with exhaustion. Across the room, Nicera stood in the dim glow, her violet skin glinting faintly like polished amethyst. Her golden eyes, usually sharp and calculating, seemed distant, lost in thoughts she had yet to share. Ethan's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he spoke. "How long do you think we have before they find us?" Nicera turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Not long. The signal will draw them like moths to flame." He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Then we'd better make sure we're ready." Nicera hesitated, her gaze softening as she stepped closer. The faint clink of her boots against the concrete was the only sound in the room now, save for the hum of the core. "Ethan," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "Before they come, there is something I must do. Something I must share with you." Ethan raised an eyebrow, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "What is it?" She paused, her golden eyes meeting his. For the first time since he'd met her, he saw vulnerability there, a crack in the armor of her regal demeanor. "Among my people, there is a custom, a bond we form with those who have saved our lives. It is more than gratitude. It is connection." Ethan tilted his head, curiosity flickering in his eyes. What kind of connection? Nicera stepped closer, her movements deliberate but unthreatening. "It is an exchange, a sharing of essence, of memory. It binds two individuals, not only in trust but in understanding." Ethan blinked, processing her words. "And you're saying, you want to do this with me?" Nicera nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "You have risked everything to save me, a stranger from a distant star. Among my people, such acts are sacred. They demand recognition. And more than that, I wish to share this with you." Her voice softened as she spoke, and Ethan felt a strange pull in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair as he tried to wrap his mind around her words. "Nicera, I don't know," he said, his voice quieter now. I didn't do this to get anything in return." "I know," she said gently. "That is why you are worthy." The room fell silent again, the air between them heavy with unspoken meaning. Ethan met her gaze, searching for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. She stood before him with quiet strength, her golden eyes unwavering. Finally, he exhaled and nodded. "All right," he said. "What do I need to do?" Nicera stepped even closer, the warmth of her presence brushing against him like sunlight. "Nothing. Only trust me." Ethan nodded again, his heart pounding in his chest as she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his arm. Her touch was warm, almost electric, and he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. Nicera closed her eyes, and a soft glow began to emanate from her skin, spreading outward like ripples in water. The golden light enveloped them both, soft and warm, and Ethan felt his breath catch in his throat. Images began to flicker in his mind, at first faint, like whispers at the edge of hearing, but then growing stronger. He saw a palace bathed in starlight, its spires reaching into a sky filled with unfamiliar constellations. The halls were lined with banners bearing intricate symbols, and figures moved through them, their faces serene but their movements purposeful. He saw Nicera as a child, her crimson hair braided and her golden eyes wide with wonder as she studied an elaborate map of the galaxy. Beside her stood a man with the same regal bearing, his features marked by age and wisdom. "My father," Nicera's voice echoed in his mind, though her lips didn't move. "King Livarus, he taught me that leadership is not about power, but about service." The vision shifted. He saw flames, heard screams. The palace halls were no longer serene but filled with chaos. Figures in dark armor stormed the corridors, their weapons cutting down those who stood in their path. Nicera's face flashed again, now older, her expression one of determination as she fought to defend her people. "I failed them," her voice came again, tinged with sorrow. "I fled when I should have stayed." No, Ethan thought, though he wasn't sure if the words were his own or something shared. "You did what you had to do." The images faded, replaced by his own memories. He saw his cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth. He saw the faces of those he had lost, the weight of their absence pressing down on him like a stone. He felt the isolation, the self-imposed exile that had defined his life for years. But then he saw something else. He saw himself standing over Nicera in the snow, his hands moving with purpose as he tended to her wounds. He saw her golden eyes flicker open, saw the unspoken trust that had passed between them in that moment. And he felt something shift, a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was missing. The glow began to fade, and Ethan opened his eyes to find Nicera standing before him, her gaze steady but softer now. He felt a strange warmth in his chest, not physical but emotional, as if something inside him had been mended. "It is done," she said quietly. "The bond is formed." Ethan exhaled, his breath shaky as he tried to find the right words. That was intense. Nicera smiled faintly, a rare expression of genuine warmth. "It is a connection unlike any other. We are bound now, Ethan Hale. Wherever this battle takes us, we will face it together." Ethan nodded, his hand brushing against hers for a moment before he let it fall to his side. "I think I'm okay with that." The sound of distant footsteps interrupted the moment, and both of them turned toward the door. The faint hum of the transponder core still filled the room, but now it was accompanied by something else, a low, rhythmic thud that grew louder with each passing second. "They're coming," Nicera said, her voice sharp but steady. She unsheathed her dagger, the blade gleaming faintly in the golden light. "And this time, they will not hold back." Ethan grabbed his rifle, his grip tightening around the stock. He glanced at Nicera, their eyes meeting for a brief moment, and he felt the bond between them solidify into something unbreakable. "Let's make it count," he said. Nicera nodded, her golden eyes blazing with determination. Together they turned toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. The hum of the transponder core pulsed gently in the hydroelectric station, its golden glow casting long shadows on the cracked walls. Ethan Hale leaned against a cold concrete pillar, his chest rising and falling as the weight of the battle ebbed slowly from his body. Beside him, Nicera stood silent, her crimson hair disheveled, her violet skin faintly glimmering in the faint light. The chaos of the Sentinels' assault was over, their hulking remains scattered across the battlefield outside. But the quiet wasn't calming, it was thick with unspoken words and lingering tension. Ethan glanced toward Nicera. She hadn't spoken since she delivered the final blow to the Prime Sentinel, her dagger slicing through its core with a decisive finality. Her golden eyes now seemed distant, gazing at the transponder core, which still broadcast her signal into the void. Help was on the way. At least, that's what they had to believe. "You all right?" Ethan asked, his voice breaking the silence. Nicera didn't answer immediately. When she finally turned to him, there was a strange intensity in her gaze, as if she was wrestling with something she hadn't yet put into words. "I am unhurt," she said, her tone measured. "But there is something I must do." Ethan furrowed his brow, lowering the rifle he hadn't realized he was still holding. "What's on your mind?" Nicera stepped closer, her movements deliberate but cautious, as though she were approaching a decision she couldn't turn back from. "Among my people, there is a custom," she began, her voice quieter now, almost reverent. "When a life is saved, a life of great importance, it is tradition to honor that act with a gift, but not a gift as you understand it. This is something deeper." Ethan's pulse quickened, though he couldn't say why. "Deeper? What do you mean?" Nicera's golden eyes met his, unwavering. "It is a sharing, of essence, of spirit. It is intimacy." Ethan blinked, his breath catching. Intimacy, his voice carried an edge of uncertainty, but he didn't pull back. Nicera nodded, her expression calm but resolute. "It is not a custom taken lightly. It is a bond formed only between those who have proven their loyalty, their worth. And you, Ethan Hale, have shown me more courage, more compassion than I could have ever expected." Ethan swallowed, his thoughts scrambling. He searched her face for any sign of hesitation, but there was none. Her words were not a suggestion or an invitation, they were a declaration of intent, spoken with the same certainty she carried into battle. "You don't owe me anything, Nicera," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I didn't do this for a reward." "I know," she said, stepping closer still. "That is why you are worthy." Her words hung in the air, and Ethan felt his resistance falter. There was no denying the connection between them, forged in fire and blood. But this was something more, something that transcended words or actions. He nodded slowly, his chest tightening. "All right, if this is what you want." Nicera's lips curved into the faintest smile, her golden eyes softening. "It is not merely what I want, Ethan. It is what you deserve." She reached out, her hands brushing his shoulders before sliding gently to his face. Her touch was warm, grounding, and Ethan felt his breath hitch. Nicera closed her eyes, and a faint glow began to emanate from her skin, spreading outward like ripples in water. Ethan felt a strange warmth seep into him, not just physical but something deeper, more profound. His mind flooded with images, not his own but hers, fragments of her life, her memories. He saw the towering spires of her palace, its walls adorned with intricate patterns that shimmered under alien suns. He felt her joy as a child, running through the halls with her father's approving gaze following her. But then the memories darkened. He felt the crushing weight of betrayal, the sting of loss, as her home burned and her people fell. The images were visceral, raw, and they pierced him with a depth of emotion he couldn't explain. Just as quickly, his own memories rose to meet hers. He saw his cabin in the woods, the quiet isolation he had embraced to escape his past. He felt the ache of old wounds, the weight of choices he wished he could undo. And then he saw Nicera, lying wounded in the snow, her golden eyes meeting his for the first time. He felt the shift in his heart, the unspoken promise that had driven him to save her. The glow between them intensified, their shared memories intertwining, until it became impossible to tell where hers ended and his began. And then, slowly, the light faded, leaving them standing in silence. Nicera's hands fell from his face, but her gaze remained locked on his. Her golden eyes glimmered with something unspoken, a mixture of gratitude and something far deeper. "It is done," she said softly. "Our bond is formed." Ethan exhaled, his chest tight as he tried to process what had just happened. That was intense. Nicera's lips quirked into a faint smile. "It is not something many experience. It is a connection that transcends time and space. Wherever we go, whatever battles we face, we are now bound." Ethan nodded, his thoughts still swirling, but one thing was clear. He wasn't alone anymore. Nicera had given him more than a gift, she had given him a piece of herself. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Both of them turned toward the door, their weapons raised instinctively. The glow of the transponder core grew brighter, signaling the arrival of Nicera's people. The figures that entered were clad in sleek armor, their faces obscured but their movements precise. One of them stepped forward, bowing deeply to Nicera. "Princess," the figure said, their voice formal but laced with relief. "We have come to bring you home." Nicera inclined her head, her regal demeanor returning. She gestured toward Ethan. "This man is my ally, my savior. He is to be treated with the utmost respect." The figure hesitated, then bowed to Ethan as well. "It will be as you command." Ethan smirked, lowering his weapon. "Nice to know I've got friends in high places." Nicera turned to him, her golden eyes softening once more. She stepped closer, placing a hand over his heart. "Ethan Hale, our bond ensures that this is not goodbye. Wherever the stars take us, you will remain a part of me." Ethan felt a pang in his chest but managed a small smile. "Take care of yourself, Nicera, and tell your father he's got one hell of a daughter." Nicera's lips curved into a genuine smile, and then she turned, boarding the ship with her people. Ethan watched as the vessel ascended into the sky, its golden light disappearing among the stars. The station fell silent once more, but the bond he had formed with Nicera lingered, a quiet promise that their paths would cross again. With a deep breath, Ethan picked up his rifle and turned back toward the forest. He wasn't the same man who had stepped into that storm days ago, and for the first time in years, he felt ready to face whatever came next.